What is up, folks? Absolutely wild timing. I am getting this out as quickly as possible. Chef David Chang, award-winning chef and restaurateur, has come out with an incredibly specific podcast. It's linked in the show notes if you want to listen to it before this or in conjunction with this, all about performance on stations. And so if you're working a station yourself, if you manage a team where line cooks or chef de parties are kind of part of your purview or part of your organization or the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis, this episode is for you. And so I'm going to go deep on exactly what David had to say, what I agree with, what I disagree with, because that's what I spend the majority of my time working on, and effectively how what we built at Total Station Domination solves a lot of these problems and why basically it makes such a huge impact for people on stations. And so, quick 60-second context here. The David Chang Show, in an episode published on March 21st, 2024, the first part of the title is Quantifying Cooking Performance. That's what you're looking for. Again, I've linked it up in the show notes just for convenience sake and because I don't want it to seem like I'm taking any of this out of context. I do my best in this episode to kind of, identify quotes and really read things in context so that I'm not just kind of cherry picking things to make my own company look good, right? I in a lot of ways, empathize and agree with a lot of what David has to say here. And so the part of the episode that you're looking for his episode starts at the 7-minute mark. And it is kind of like a Q&A episode. So the co-host that David Chang is talking with is kind of feeding him questions. And David, in a lot of ways, is like speaking off the cuff. And so the question from the listener effectively says, quote,
"Dear Dave, the NFL Draft Combine just happened and the NFL Draft is coming up soon. I feel like NFL Combine measurables are oftentimes specious and don't necessarily translate to on-field success. If cooks and chefs had an NFL Draft Combine, what skills would you test for to get a general idea of their cooking ability? But things that don't necessarily make for a great cook or chef." Tyler K.
Okay, so for my breakdown, the way that I want to frame this for you folks, just so that I'm just not meandering around too much, is through 3 core kind of like pillars or ideas. 1 is what I'm calling the danger of proxies. 2 is effective measuring, specifically through the lens of what we've developed called the station score. And then, most importantly, what to do with this information. So kind of like, where do we go from here? If we were to be able to theoretically measure somebody's output and performance on their station, what would we do with that information? And so let's start with what I'm calling the danger of proxies. And I love that David uses the NFL to kind of draw equivalencies here. The person who asked the question, just knowing that David Chang loves the NFL, has asked the question in this way. I do the same thing comparing chefs to athletes. They did this with Coach K in season 2 of The Bear with Sydney and how she was kind of reading his book on coaching and athletics. And I certainly have my whole series that I've been publishing for years on the channel called Reps, where I kind of try to prioritize progressive overload to teach things like knife skills and plating. And so David and I certainly agree on the connection we're drawing here between cooking professionally and being a professional athlete. That we are 100% aligned on. But athletic endeavors also suffer from, again, what I'm calling the danger of this thing called proxies. And so let's define our terms here. A proxy is effectively a measure you'll use to try to determine something else. And so what's an example? In the Army, they will use push-ups or pull-ups as a proxy for determining how fit you are, right? And so your doctor, another proxy, uses something called BMI, or that's a number that effectively estimates your body fat based on a person's weight and their height. And so it's calculated by dividing weight in kilograms by the height of that person in meters squared. Another test that's pretty popular these days is calculating your VO2 max, again, as a proxy for how good your cardiovascular fitness is. And a lot of people, the lines blur here because I think the reason that VO2 max has become such a you need to get your VO2 max tested is because people are starting to realize that there are better tests than others. And other certain ones is let's take the pull-ups as an example. If someone can't do 2 pull-ups, you can kind of determine by proxy that they may have some room to improve on strength training in their back, their grip strength, their physical body weight. And so the pull-ups themselves are easier to execute for that person. And so the list goes on. What sucks about proxies, and the reason I'm calling this section what I'm calling it, is that they can often deceive you. Is because of the pull-up test goal is 10 pull-ups, and you have someone who's 265 pounds, and they can bang out 8 pull-ups. You might say, oh, well, that person can't do 10 pull-ups. That's a bad test. But there's no way you can look at me with a straight face and say a 265-pound person who can bang out 8 consistent pull-ups in a row, that person isn't strong. That person is incredibly strong. And so going back to David Chang, in his episode, the first proxy that he uses is family meal. And what he's trying to determine is how much someone gives a shit or not.
Do they give a shit? Do they care? Do they love it? Right? And loving it doesn't mean waking up every day and being like, I'm going to be the greatest chef of all time. It's like loving it means I'm going to try to do my best in the face of all kinds of obstacles in front of me. and I'm not going to bitch and moan, and I'm going to try to do it, and I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus. Like that. Loving it is a pretty long definition for me. There's a lot that encompasses it. But if there was a combine and there happened to be a theoretical amount of cooks there, I would, to me, first and foremost, I want to build it around culture and team and having everybody that is like-minded in that degree of like, they want to do good shit.
And I'm going to try to give some grace here because he does admit that, quote, there's a lot that encompasses it. And so he's trying to be as like brief and concise as possible in the podcast episode, but he also says that having somebody make family meal is, quote, like literally the only test you need, end quote. And I'm like, come on, man. Like anybody who's made family meal for a team at a high caliber restaurant knows that it's a completely different game than what happens during service. And I just don't think it's a good proxy for judging how someone, even like take cooking ability as one thing, but like how much they care, right? Like family meal in a lot of these restaurants is served out of hotel pans. It's eaten out of deli containers or plastic plates. And contrast that with like the dishes during service have precise knife cuts and painstakingly made sauces, and they're served on fine china, and they rely on hyper specific timing. And at the risk of bringing up the bear outside of my series on YouTube, it feels like David Chang is trying to screen for like a Marcus-like person with this proxy. For those that haven't seen the show, Marcus is like this, gets really in his head about stuff, and he really wants to read all the cookbooks and absorb all the information. And so for David to basically identify that finding somebody who wants to make a Detroit-style pizza, he says, quote,
almost like a teacher that buys their own supplies. Like they bought their own pan to cook a Detroit-style pizza because they've never had that before. And you can see that they care and they're asking questions about it and they make it. And maybe it's not delicious.
Mm-hmm.
It's delicious to every single person in that kitchen because they know that person gave a shit.
Mm-hmm.
If you see that, you bet the house on that kind of person.
I guess my question is, are there people who apply at high caliber restaurants who genuinely don't give a shit? I think there's people who have like either big egos or want to kind of like stand out from other people, or who don't have that good of like interpersonal, kind of like skills in themselves. But asked a different way, I'm basically trying to identify, like, would it matter if someone could totally crush their station, all their results were like the way that we wanted them to be, and they don't care about expanding beyond that restaurant's food? Wouldn't you rather have that? Like, if you're gonna, like, if you find the person who is just like nutty about modern, like Chinese cooking or Japanese sushi or, like cooking over fire, and that person is going to apply at Saison, does it matter that that person doesn't care about Detroit-style pizza? I don't necessarily know. Like, the place where I come back to, I want to read a quick excerpt about another great chef that I worked for named Thomas Keller. And he has this mental model of desire over passion. I'm going to read that quote to you quickly here. Quote, "It's not about passion. Passion is something that we tend to overemphasize, that we certainly place too much importance on. Passion ebbs and flows. To me, it's about desire. If you have a constant, unwavering desire to be a cook, then you're going to be a great cook. If it's only about passion, sometimes you'll be good and sometimes you won't. You've got to come in every day with a strong desire. With passion, if you see the first asparagus of the springtime and you become passionate about it, so much the better. But 3 weeks later, when you've seen that asparagus every day now, passions have subsided. What's going to make you treat the asparagus the same? It's the desire." End quote. And I read this quote in the context of what David Chang is trying to screen for, because he's actually right that this caring or passion is worth screening for, but not for somebody running a station. Take an R&D role, for example. You almost need that person to be willing to go down rabbit holes and explore and wander and nerd out about unrelated cuisines and disconnected ideas in order to arrive at something that's worth developing or putting on the menu. But instead, what I think he's falsely trying to screen for, like giving a shit and wanting to, he uses the example of like show up early, right? For work. And again, I've sang the praises of doing something like that in the past, but I think that's like over and above, like that's something nice to have. But it's like, if you're actually trying to screen for something like that, I think you can almost come up with like false equivalencies, or it's really easy to fake like caring about, the role. I think any of us who have kind of like shown up as our best selves in an interview sometimes. It's like, it's a kind of by definition artificial environment. And so instead, in Total Station Domination, we have something called a results measure. So the whole module is dedicated to results. It's called Dominate Results. And what we try to screen for is the ability to deliver results that align with clear qualities. Can you do that or can you not? It's trying to be as binary objective as possible. And so you might kind of naturally ask, what are the clear qualities of what I'm trying to execute on? And so to illustrate this, I've used the Momofuku pork buns as an example, just because this is a David Chang focused episode. I'm not, again, trying to call anybody out here. This is like, I went to Noodle Bar's Instagram and I kind of like did some research and some recon on what does an order of pork buns need to have from a clear qualities perspective. And so I'm going to list these out as I'm looking at the example on screen here. So each order needs to have 2 pork buns. That seems like super rudimentary, but like anybody who's worked with somebody who like, you go to plate up the pork buns and they pass up a plate that has 1 pork bun on it, it's like, whoa, that's wrong, right? And you can look at that and you can say, objectively, that's wrong. Each order needs to have 2 buns. The buns need to be fully steamed, so they need to not have any raw dough in the middle, but not soggy. Right? So there's like a thing that we're trying to nail here on a continuum here, where it's like, this is undercooked, this is overcooked, this is acceptable, this is clear, this is the quality that we're trying to go for. The pork needs to, it looks like from what I'm seeing, needs to be 1 centimeter thick, and then the rectangle itself needs to be 3 centimeters by 6 centimeters, something like that. It needs to be, as per the Momofuku book, it's on my shelf right here. I went ahead and I pulled it out and I looked at it. And what I love about the book is he actually lays out some incredibly clear qualities for how that pork needs to be cooked. He says it needs to be cooked in an oven twice until it's tender but not falling apart. Amazing quality here. And it needs to have, he calls it a down pillow-like yield to a firm finger poke. Oh my goodness, that's incredibly clear. And on the pickup, what I'm seeing, it needs to be seared in a pan until it's heated through, not burnt, but it also needs to have a light Maillard reaction on each side of the pork belly. It also needs to have 1 tablespoon of hoisin sauce, that's directly from the book, 3 slices of quick pickled cucumber. We can even get specific as to say maybe 2 millimeters thick on the slices. All of this gets served in a specific plate, and it obviously gets assembled in a specific order. There's like an order of operations in which you build these steam buns. And so, if you're listening to all of what I outlined here, and you're having trouble doing this with a dish on your station, you're trying to rack your brain and say, well, yeah, what are the qualities of the stuff that I do on a day-to-day? A helpful way to determine these qualities is to invert the execution, similar to what I talked about with like just passing up a plate with 1 pork bun on it or 3 pork buns on it. You'd be like, yeah, that's wrong. And so if you were working that station for 6 months, you could look at the way that somebody plated something and be like, there's too much of this, that's the wrong bowl, incorrect placement of that, there's not enough sauce, the list goes on. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather hire somebody who can execute on the qualities we're going for and deliver those results consistently, rather than how elaborate of a staff meal can you make. Plus, considering we've done the work to lay out these clear qualities, you can objectively measure this and actually work towards being able to determine, okay, here's where you're lacking and here's what can be improved on. Because you might be awesome at the knife cuts of executing, like there's spring onion on this and you got your cucumber slices just right, but it's like you aren't searing the pork belly for long enough, or you're not steaming the buns for long enough, or you're steaming them for too long. Like you're not setting a timer for the way when you put a bun in the steamer and you need to set a timer and then you need to pull it out after 4 minutes or whatever that happens to be. I'm going to stay on this rant for a second because speaking of steam buns, David actually lays out a specific example of the steam bun station at Noodle Bar as it relates to what he calls 2 key skills to have on a station. 1, being organized, and 2, quote, doing that over and over again, end quote. That being reaching in and out of the steamer basket to pull out the steam buns.
If you work the bun station, you're getting crushed. The steam bun station. This was like a revelation for me. It took me some time because everybody, regardless of who you are and your experience, you start off there.
Right.
And it's hard because you know every order you're getting at least 1.
Mm-hmm.
You're always going to be in the weeds. And you're putting your hand into a hot steamer every time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nothing wrong with the cook, but if you don't have the tolerance to, withstand the pain of putting your hand ever so quickly into a steamer, you're not going to be good at that station. It doesn't mean you're a bad cook. So it caused me to reevaluate the whole thing. I was like, oh, I can't put everyone here because some people just have a different pain tolerance.
I need people who feel comfortable doing that over and over and over again.
So like, I need to know if somebody, that's really the only, not want to say the only skill, but that is the number one skill. Besides being organized and all that stuff, the number one skill is, can they do it over and over and over again?
And I say skills in quotes because you guessed it, I absolutely want to go deeper on this. And at the risk of breaking momentum as I'm going on this rant, I do want to take just a quick second to clarify. I'm not trying to say that David Chang is wrong. He was speaking off the cuff in this podcast to a listener submitted question. This is probably something he comes in and sits down and records completely cold. And that's the thing. The stuff he says sounds right. I see chefs doing this all the time. They say stuff and it sounds correct to say this because of course we want people to be organized. Of course we want to be able to have consistent execution. But to me, it's the same thing as, like, have you folks ever played a video game before and you're wanting to get better at the game? And so you go on Reddit or something to look for tips on how to play this game better. And maybe you just like lurk the threads on Reddit, or maybe you actually make a post of your own and you're saying, hey, I'm trying to reach this rank, or I'm trying to get better at this skill in this game. And someone in the comments says that oh so frustrating line of just get good. Get good. It's like, it's a meme in gaming, get good. And of course that's what you should do. That's what I want. I want to be good. But that's why I like this quote from psychologist Greg Northcraft, where he says, quote, an expert is someone who has a predictive model that actually works, end quote. And get good is not a predictive model. I think the same thing when I hear, I want you to be more consistent, or I want you to be more organized. It's like, that's not a model that I can work off of. And so for what David is referencing here, we go deeper on in Total Station Domination. So with be organized, that's effectively the singular focus of the first 3 modules of the program. And so we prioritize tasks, setup, and counts. But the 2 specific measures that I think are the biggest tell of a station's level of organization are actually more mental than physical. And I think people hear setup and they're like, yeah, I want your setup to be organized. Most people can put together a setup that's organized. That's not the hardest one of all of the measures. But for the mental ones, tasks and counts, for tasks, the measure that we use is, can you provide a status update on your own tasks within 60 seconds, the tasks that you own? And for counts, the measure is share accurate counts and timings on key deliverables at all times. And so the way that this practically plays out, you can kind of, like imagine yourself standing in a kitchen right now, is that your station partner comes up to the station and asks, how many portions of trout do we have? Or your sous chef walks up to your station and says, hey, how are you looking for today? Basically, they're asking you for a status update. And at the risk of having these measures come across as proxies, maybe they are. To me, it's very hard to hide in those situations. Because think about it. It's not reasonable for someone to have counts memorized for every single deliverable on their station. Just unrealistic. It's like constantly changing. There's so many deliverables that you're responsible for. It's like it might be this count one day, or like you're trying to remember how much you had from the night before. And so if they really want to hit the measure of being able to share those counts, they probably have to have some sort of system for how to keep track of those numbers. That might be labeling the hotel pans with portion amounts, or putting, like you have a little X58 on your deli container, or you're writing counts next to the prep list items as you're finishing them, or like maybe you come in at the start of your day and you're saying, okay, I'm going to compare the number of guests we have coming in today to the number of prep, the amount of prep that I need to do, or maybe you did that the night before when you put in your orders. It's basically like, to me, that's an expression of organization. That's what organization looks like. And it's the same thing with tasks. When your sous chef asks the question, how are you looking today? The opposite of what this looks like, or what disorganization looks like, is the person that says, I think I'm looking good, chef. It's like, compare that with the person who says, yes, chef, the turnips are done. I've got the collard greens braising in the oven. I'm butchering the chicken now, and I'm going to be blending the carrot puree next after that comes off reducing. Sure. That person might be hyper in the moment of prep as they gave that update, but the actual big brain way that you do this status update is by literally just updating your sous chef with reading off what your prep list says. It's not hard to give that status update when you track your tasks in an organized way. And compare this with the person who just tries to memorize everything, and they're trying to rack their brain, and they give the status update and they think that they've gotten everything done, but they've completely forgotten about the fact that like they haven't even started the beats yet, right? The person who uses a prep list, especially if it's the free template that I have that expands and prioritizes and organizes your tasks. It's linked in the description. It's absolutely free wherever you're listening to this. That person is going to be way more organized. And on the consistency point that David made, we already talked about the organization part. I'm right there with him. Consistency is huge in restaurants, and it can make or break the execution, depending on where you're working. And when I was building Total Stage Domination, I kept coming back to consistency as this thing of like, that's the dream outcome. And of course we want consistency, but I really challenged myself to ask, what's the skill here? And so what I landed on is actually putting this in the movement module. And so let me explain this equation to you that I came up with to really define consistency. It's what to do plus, this is like a math equation, an algebra equation. So it's what to do plus how to do it times speed divided by obstacles plus 1. And it has to be plus 1 because if you have 0 obstacles, it'd be dividing by 0. So we can't have that. And all of that equals your movement. And so I've got it on screen for those that are watching on YouTube. But to me, all this entire equation, what to do plus how to do it times speed divided by 1 plus obstacles, culminates into basically having consistency be the byproduct of being able to do that. And then, by definition, any issue with consistency that you have can be identified inside of this equation. So if someone's not consistent, you can ask yourself, okay, do they know what to do? Do they know how to do it? Are they not fast enough? Or do they have a massive amount of obstacles getting in their way? And each of these toggles open further, you're starting to notice. That's why consistency is like such a bad measure in my mind to like try to prioritize. Of course it's important, but it's like, it's so frustrating to nail down exactly why someone's struggling because each of these, we can expand it even more. Where tackling obstacles is covered in the problem solving modules of Total Stage Domination. We have a whole module dedicated to speed. If that person's like, I can't go faster, it's deeper than this. And so the list goes on here. What I'm effectively hoping to do is make a case here for how you can improve these in your own work and why it's so important to really call out the difference between, again, this is another mental model I came up with as I was writing this, the difference between a skill and a signifier. So bringing it back to fitness, strong or strength is a signifier. Someone can absolutely be signified as being strong. But tell me exactly what is the skill of being strong? If you were able to describe what do you mean by someone being strong, you would probably inadvertently describe skills as you outline it. And so it's like signifiers are the big umbrella, and underneath you have skills that kind of like culminate into a signifier. And what's another example? Endurance. Endurance is a signifier. Endurance is not a skill. And so what I'm trying to say is that David Chang prioritizes consistency and organization. That's important, but they're signifiers. They're not skills. We teach skills instead in Total Stage Domination. And so let's talk about another proxy that I think people over-index on, and that's how sharp your knives are. And before you pull out your phone and message me in all caps on Instagram, I know this might sound like blasphemy from some of you folks that join my knife sharpening live streams. I think knife sharpening and having sharp knives at work is super important. But I do have a quick funny story on this. So for those that don't know, my knife sharpening nerdiness runs deep, so deep. I learned how to sharpen on whetstones in my first semester of culinary school at the Culinary Institute of America. It was through a combination of literally spending time in the Corin showroom in New York City, watching the DVDs that they would play on this tiny little TV right next to the knife cases. They probably hated that I was just some kid who would just stand there in the showroom and watch the videos. And I would sometimes buy things and I would sometimes just come in and try to watch them. I should have just bought the DVDs now that I'm just kind of reflecting back on it. And I would combine that with going into the communal men's bathroom in my dorm room at school because there was this one guy who was 1 year ahead of me and he would sharpen his knives in the bathroom. And so I would just spend time watching him and I'd bring my stones and I'd be like, hey, can we sharpen together today? And then I'd ask him a ton of questions. And so I was trying to do this like theory plus practice in order to get better sharpening knives on a whetstone. And so where am I going with this story? When I got my externship at Per Se, there was one day when my sous chef, it was Daniel Calvert. He's literally the chef of the best restaurant in Tokyo right now, as per World's 50 Best. It's called Seizen is the name of the restaurant, spelled Sezanne. You should absolutely look it up and go eat there if you are going to Tokyo. But Danny, one day, he went to go cut a cryovac bag with his knife. And his knife was so dull that it could not cut the cryovac bag. And he was a sous chef at Per Se. And he looked at me after he did it, and he was like, well, that's embarrassing. My knife's pretty dull, huh? And I was like, I can sharpen that knife for you if you want. And lo and behold, he took me up on it. I took the knife home that night, I sharpened it, and I brought it back to him the next day, and he was beyond stoked to have a sharp knife for that day. But what I'm trying to say here is anyone going to look at Danny and have the balls to tell him that he's a bad cook? because his knife was not sharp. I know, for me personally, I've worked with so many people who have dull AF knives on the day-to-day, and they literally just find ways to work around it. Whether we like it or not, that's how, like, the world spins around. Like, they use people that with dull knives, they'll use machine slicers, they'll use mandolins, they will punt their knife cuts to a sous chef or the AM prep team to do it for them. Or like they'll literally ask to borrow knives from other people on the day-to-day because they can just not be bothered to sharpen their own knives or like pay to get them sharpened somewhere. In fact, again, I think knife sharpness can be a bad proxy because someone literally could have bought a new knife in anticipation for the stage that they're kind of coming to trail for, and it could be super sharp, but their knife cuts are all wonky and they take forever to finish the task and their station is super messy, but it's like, oh, their knives are sharp, therefore we should hire them. I think that's a bad proxy to use. And combine that with the fact that I think people bucket knife skills into one like overarching header of like, let's judge this person on their knife skills. And they never actually explain, what do you mean by knife skills? Because anybody who's worked in a restaurant for long enough knows that dicing onions with a 210 millimeter chef knife, cleaning and turning radishes with a bird's beak knife, slicing snap peas on a bias with a nikiri, doing fennel brunoise with a petty knife, and slicing beef culotte against the grain with a 270 millimeter sujihiki in the heat of service are all very different knife skills. Said another way, just because you can dice onions doesn't mean you're fast or effective at fennel brunoise, and vice versa. Again, that's why I position my reps videos the way that I do on YouTube. Those are linked in the show notes. They're absolutely free if you want to check those out. And even as I write this podcast episode script, I'm thinking to myself, like, have I done a bad job of articulating, like, get better at your knife skills? It's like, what I'm really trying to say is basically, like, improve yourself on these specific types of cuts. Because I think that I try to pick cuts that I think are actually, like, more widely applied in professional kitchens. And so let's bring it all the way back to David Chang. I asked myself, as I made TSD, can we combine objective measures to almost kind of like triangulate somebody's knife skills? I believe you can. And so you can start with the results measure. We already talked about that. Can this person deliver results that align with clear qualities? Let's use the fennel brunoise as an example. The size is right. The angles are 90 degrees. They aren't producing too much waste and they're getting a good yield on this prep project. Awesome. But that's doing one head of fennel. What you actually want now is for that person to be able to boost that output when needed. You want them to be able to do 2 liters of fennel brunoise. We can measure that too, because if you remember from your middle school physics class, speed is just distance over time. That's the equation for how physicists calculate speed. And so for us, if it's a pretty clear standard for a liter of fennel brunoise to take, let's say, 40 minutes, based on that restaurant's precision, how they need the fennel brunoise to look, it takes 40 minutes to do that. That should be the first goal that you try to push for. And each task in a kitchen effectively has this acceptable band of time where it's generally accepted for how long that task should take. If someone were to say, like, yeah, I've been doing this fennel brunoise for 2 hours and I only have a half a deli, you'd be like, 2 hours? And we can flip it to the other end of that time band. If someone were to be like, yeah, I got the fennel done in 4 minutes, you'd be like, let me see that fennel, right? Again, bringing this back to evaluating knife skills. What we try to screen for in TSD is being able to double that standard output when needed. And so what that means is if standard is 40 minutes, you should be able to do a liter of fennel brunoise to the standard that aligns with the clear quality that we're trying to go for in 20 minutes. And these two together, results plus speed, gives us the ability to objectively evaluate someone's ability on that specific knife skill. And it's got to be both, because you need them to be able to deliver the result, and it needs to happen in a reasonable amount of time. And notice, none of this is affected by how much they quote-unquote care or how sharp any one of their specific knives are. And a sharp knife certainly might make it easier to achieve that result, but it's in no way necessary to achieve it. And if it is, I need you to share how you're measuring sharpness specifically, because I can point to several old coworkers of mine who somehow make it work with knives that aren't quote-unquote as sharp as you're probably outlining. And so, yeah, he does mention a couple of other proxies in the episode, but I now want to tie in a couple of other tests that David has seen in his career and talk about why I don't believe that they make for good measures and what I believe would be better measures to use instead. And so he talks about the dreaded cook a dish test. And David Chang says,
when I tried to get a job at Cafe Bleu, Carmelini would make you cook 3 courses in a team full of like killers, right? It was like murderer's row in terms of talented cooks. And you have the sick produce and he's like, cook whatever you want. That's really difficult to do.
God, that sounds terrifying.
During service, and you got to like cook it for him. And when he's eating it, everybody's watching. It's very stressful. So you can see a lot in that regard. Oftentimes, somebody that's staging or interviewing for a job, you can just see if they care.
All right, just for sake of example, I'll play ball here. Let's say that cooking a dish or cooking 3 courses for the executive chef is the measure that we're going to want to try to go for. Let's just pick one dish as an example. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Is the dish delicious? And in a lot of respects, regardless of if the roasted mushroom that you prepared is too salty, or if the beet that you made didn't have any acid on it, or if the fish that you cooked was overcooked, all of that will literally be forgotten about and fixed when you get put on the station. Because again, the deliverables that you're responsible for on your station will have clear qualities. So in my opinion, it's a bad measure to use on this like random hodgepodge dish that you decided to make on the fly. What I find personally is that what most chefs look for in these cook a dish moments is anecdotally actually mentioned by David Chang later in the episode, but we actually distill it into real measures. And so I'm going to read what David Chang says later in the episode. He says, quote,
I mean, all the little things. Are there the station, usually they're probably in the back or something. Do they do everything right? Right? Are their knives sharp? Are their sea folds properly lined up? Are there towels that they were given like nice? Do they have a wet towel? Do they have a dry towel? Are they notepad, pen, paper? Are they taking notes? Are they asking questions, knowing when to ask questions, not during the middle of service when you're in the weeds? All of these intuitive things that you can really test a lot about.
And all of these are being watched when you're preparing that dish. That's the thing that the chefs are actually trying to notice. Again, it's not, how was the roasted mushroom that you prepared? Sure, maybe they might say like there was a little bit too much salt on that, but like what they're actually trying to look for are these other like observables as you're going through the process. And so for a new line cook, they hear the words properly lined up sea folds, and they understandably ask, what does that mean? What is properly lined up sea folds? I personally know a lot of chefs that point to something called knolling when it comes to this kind of stuff. Knolling, for those that don't know, is this act of lining things up at 90-degree angles. And so you can think of like your home screen on your phone as being perfectly knolled. Even though there are tiny app icons and medium-sized widgets, all of the squares or the rectangles are facing the same direction. There's equal spacing between things, and it would be weird if one of your apps was like slightly tilted 12 degrees to the right? But that's a digital environment. In a physical environment like your station, there are specific scenarios where knolling is actually not optimal. We can take a stack of sauté pans as an example. Having that perfectly knolled might either involve shifting the handles of those pans 10 inches to the right of your stove, meaning you have to reach an extra length of distance every single time you grab a sauté pan, or it might mean that yes, these sauté pans are perfectly knolled and they're on this shelf above my stove, but that means that the handles get ripping hot because they're exposed to the burners that I have going on other pickups, on stations, on physical environments, because we are humans. There is no 90 degrees on my body. It's like it needs to be an ergonomic setup. I need to make sure that things work for my station, but having everything be knolled all the time is not always the best advice. Which brings me to the total station domination measure for setup being the ability to create and maintain a basic, strategic, and hygienic setup. So, heading back to our seafold example, where and how should your seafolds go? Because having workstations myself in some of the best restaurants in the world, it doesn't make a big difference whether that stack of seafolds is on the right side of your cutting board or on the top of the cutting board on the left side. What does matter is if I'm watching you work and the placement of those seafolds is causing you to knock the stack of seafolds over on every third pickup because your placement of those seafolds is getting in the way of the garnish trays you're assembling, or you've decided to put 2 stacks of seafolds on top of one another and it's like the leaning tower of paper, that's bad. I really hope I'm articulating the difference enough here, and what's awesome with this way of evaluating folks is that it leaves room for customization. That's what I want to do in this program. In most kitchens, there isn't one correct answer to a workflow. You can drop the tempura in the fryer and then put the ponzu in a bowl while you wait for the fryer to cook the thing, or you can pre-fill 20 ponzu bowls at the start of service. They both work. They're both correct answers. It just depends on your strategy, and as long as it allows you to hit all of the other measures that we're going for in TSD, at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world if someone does something slightly different than you do. If anything, adopting this mindset of, like mods and customization makes you less hard-headed and more open-minded to having someone show you another way to do things that might get you better results or save you a step or decrease complexity on your station. And again, David Chang is a much more successful chef than I am. I don't want this to be me talking shit this whole episode. David, if you're listening, I actually have a request for you at the end of this episode, because I do agree with your point on towels. Even though you use the arbitrary adjective of nice to describe the towels that person working the station or that staging was given, we in TSD use the word hygienic to describe someone's station setup, because that does matter, right? Having a carrot puree splotched towel does make the station look messy and unhygienic. But again, anyone who's worked a station knows that what happens when you get a carrot puree splotched towel is you add the I need to clean this towel to the list of running movements that you've got in your head, and you go to the sink and you wrap the tip of that towel around the faucet and you run hot water through the towel and you stretch the towel fibers apart so you can get as much of that puree rinsed out as you can. And even if it's a little still bit orange in certain spots, you fold the towel in a way where that stained part is now on the inside of the towel and the non-stained part of the towel is now facing out for everybody to see. And I say that again because the young cook that's listening to this episode who hears, got it, all towels must never not be nice, they're going to piss off the chef de cuisine, because the second their towel gets a little bit soiled, they're going to throw it in the laundry pile. And then they're going to get disciplined because the chef de cuisine is going to be like, what happened to all your towels? Moving on. The notepad, the pen, asking questions. I have a video on the channel that's like 6 years old talking about bringing notebooks into work. So I totally agree here. Like, applause for that. And with the timing of questions, he's right. When it's 6 p.m. and 80% of the dining room has been sat and the chef de cuisine is reading off tickets as an expediter, going up to that expediter and asking them a question about how they cure the salmon roe, it's probably not the best time. But if during your interview you were paired up on the fish station with the person working that station and it's also 6 p.m. in the middle of service, you asking them about the Vin John sauce and the lobster might be totally fine, because that rush, quote unquote, hasn't hit their station yet in the flow of service, and they're just like, they're chilling on their station. It's totally fine to ask questions then. And so him saying like, don't ask questions during service, it's like, that can also maybe send the wrong message. Again, not trying to bash David Chang, caveat, caveat, caveat. I'm just trying to provide some nuance on this topic because I think it can really make a difference of whether you get their job or not in these types of kitchens on your stage. And so trying to provide a framework here on asking questions. Run yourself through this kind of checklist for yourself. 1, who am I asking this to? Is it reasonable for this person to have the answer to my question? And do they reasonably have time in this moment to answer the question? You can kind of just like take a step back, look at the situation, and ask yourself these questions. 2, how can I phrase my question in a way where I'm more likely to get an accurate and satisfying answer? In podcasting, for example, me as the interviewer, I'm always trying to not ask yes or no questions because it makes for an incredibly boring and short interview. Instead, I ask more open-ended questions so that I can tease out stories from the guests that I have on this podcast. You can sometimes do the opposite in kitchens. So instead of, how do you guys make this dough? You can really push yourself to say, what is it that I really want to know? What am I really trying to ask here? Got it. I want to know if they knead this dough in a machine or if they make this dough by hand. And so the question that you might formulate and then actually eventually ask to that person is, hey, for this dough, do you guys use a machine to develop the gluten? You're going to get a yes or no answer for that. And those yes or no questions can be super valuable because worst case scenario, they just snap a response at you and then you say, oof, got it. Not a good time to be asking questions. And then best case scenario, they actually expand on their answer, and then you can just use like common sense and situational awareness to gauge if it makes sense to ask a follow-up question. Number 3, step 3 in Justin's like, when is it a good time to ask questions or not in this situation? 3, can you tie a reason into your question so that you don't just come off as a curious George in the kitchen? I think that's really what people are trying to prevent in this kind of like, it's not a good time to ask questions, is the kind of like, I call this the curious George, the person who is like just so curious about stuff and just really wants to be there to learn. And because you're a stage and you don't have any responsibilities, sure, you just want to be seen as like, you don't want to be seen as like, you're just trying to lean up against the countertop. It's like, you want to be seen as engaged. And so you're trying to ask questions, not understanding the fact that like the person who you're asking the question to is like beyond in the weeds and they're just like chaos surrounding them. And so what I teach in TSD is a principle called preference jujitsu in the comms module, in the communication module, where as you get more experienced and even spend more time with people, you can start to identify what they care about. And so if you frame your question through helping that person accomplish more of what they care about, you give yourself a much higher likelihood of getting an answer that you're happy with. Low waste is an example. A lot of chefs prioritize low waste in their kitchens. And so a Mass it's no longer a restaurant. It was this restaurant in Copenhagen. Matt Orlando was the chef of that restaurant. He was the old chef de cuisine of Noma. He branched off and opened his own thing. And sustainability and being low waste was like one huge pillar of that restaurant concept. And so I can look at Matt Orlando and I can say, that's a preference that Chef Matt has. And so instead of asking Chef Matt, how do I portion this? That's like a very open-ended question. There's no yes or no thing that I can respond to with that. You might go to Chef Matt and you say, hey, Chef, I'm looking to get the best yield out of this celery root. Can you get with me on portioning the first one together? Amazing. That person has a yes or no response. You've tied it to something that they care about. And like you're telling them that like, I'm about to do this thing. I need help on this. And so notice in that example, I'm also letting this person know that it's going to be quick. I just want you to do this first one with me and then I'm going to be good. It's not going to be this long, drawn-out conversation with a million follow-up questions. You can make this even easier for yourself by saying something like, I've already got a cutting board and a tray set up. Can you come over and get with me for a minute just to do this first one together? And sure, the person that you're asking this question to might say, you need a third pan for finished portions. Oh my goodness, they called out a flaw in the way that you set up your station. But that's where your notebook comes in. Because as you're standing there asking the question, you write down third pan underneath the celery root, kind of like example notes that you're taking. And then they can see that you're documenting the process. And then that's like a tick in like, oh my goodness, Justin's doing a great job. And so rounding this section out, he has a couple of other measures that he mentions, and I just want to call these out mostly because I asked myself these questions too as I was coming up with this program. And so what David says, and just for context, he's talking about the context of like a winning or high caliber kitchen team. And as he's talking about an individual performer that you might be evaluating, he says, quote,
and that's the thing is you might be able to find somebody if you have all the data, like this person has shitty knife skills. That's verified. They're like a little messy, but they're always trying to get organized. They're always trying to get better. And their palate is a little weird, right? It's just not there, whatever. And they don't have the creativity, whatever.
But we win.
Like we always have great services with this person. You're like, what the fuck?
Again, breaking down these measures, to me, it might be controversial, but the creativity piece can almost be eliminated right off the bat. Right? Like if you're working a station, you aren't being hired to be creative. You're hired to turn inputs into outputs. And 9 times out of 10, the leadership team is telling you exactly what to cook. It's not, said another way, like it's not like you're coming onto your station at the start of the day and you're like, scratching your chin. I wonder what I'm going to make today. Like you know exactly what you need to make every single day. Again, I'm not saying creativity is not important. We can get into that discussion in the comments or on X or in Instagram DMs, but given the choice between someone who can follow instructions and perform compared with someone who is just like quote unquote creative, I know what most chefs would pick for the person running that station. And on the palate front, we can bucket that with our results measure. We can take all of the inbuilt human differences in how we perceive flavor and aroma and texture. So someone's a smoker, for example. For those that don't know, they say that smoking dulls your palate. More salt is typically required for a smoker to feel like something is seasoned. And so when a non-smoker tastes a dish that a smoker prepared, it can often come off as too salty. Or if someone's like, say, a certified super taster. Yes, those exist. Or someone doesn't eat specific foods. My question is like, who cares? Like that dish still needs to taste a specific way regardless of who's running the station. And so the person on that station, in my opinion, just needs to learn those clear qualities and deliver results that align with those qualities. And so you can just invert this for yourself. Like, would you go to your favorite pho restaurant and be like, oh, the pho is going to be super salty today. Jeremy's working. No restaurant works like that. Sure, someone's palate might come into play when it's time for them to be in charge of putting a new dish on the menu, but not at the point of the station level execution. A quick story that really hammers this point home to me is that we had this vegetarian guy that we hired at this seafood focused fine dining restaurant that I was working at. And so he wouldn't eat his mise en place because he was vegetarian. And so I'm not bashing being a vegetarian, but it did pose a problem for his day-to-day execution on his station. And so he eventually just came around to either tasting his prep and then spitting it out or having a tasting session with the sous chef every single day of like, here's what I made. I need you to taste my prep. And so said another way, his palate being quote unquote weird wasn't going to affect the performance of the station. It could not be the case that that was how we operated. It was just like we found a way around that. All right, we are on the third section of this episode. This is the what to do with this information part. And so as we wrap this up, if any of this has caused your ears to perk up, or if you found yourself nodding along to anything that I've been ranting on, good news. You're probably a great fit for Total Station Domination. It is linked in the description. As of recording, there are 2 buttons on the top of the landing page. If you want to take the program for yourself, you can just tap the Enroll Now button. You get instant access to all the content. It's over 11 hours of my best lessons. If you scroll down just a hair on that page, you can actually get your station score for the station that you're working right now absolutely free. And if you want this program for your team, there's another button at the top of the page where you can sign up for a call with us. We'll identify exactly how to help with your onboarding and decrease your turnover and increase the performance in your team. Effectively, the offer that we're providing for businesses right now is a 20% minimum increase in performance for your team, measured objectively via the station score. You get the report sent straight to your management team for just a 1% increase in your payroll cost. 1%, that's less than probably the fees you're paying your payroll provider right now for how to get your payroll processed. And so again, that's linked in the description if you want to check that out. But let's round out this episode with what to do with this information. And so I created the station score for this next quote.
There's always fluidity in a kitchen. In the good kitchens, it always happens because you want people to leave. Sometimes they come back, but you're leaving to go abroad or whatever. So let's just say the meat roast person and the poissonnier, they've become a sous chef and one's going to another restaurant, right? They leave. So now you have to bump up 2 people. So everyone gets elevated for the most part. And if you don't get elevated, it's a sign to a more difficult job. And difficulty is relative because sometimes your new station isn't difficult. It's just more prestigious.
Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden, you had a super strong garde manger station. You had like 2 killers and they're now working the hotline. So it's like losing them in free agency.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And now you got some, 5th string offensive linemen and you're like, well, we gotta fucking do it. And it's clear to anybody in that kitchen and be like, oh my God.
Yeah.
These 3 people are amazing.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much, they add so much value to a successful service than these 2 greenhorns. Right. So that's a simple win above replacement that happens in every kitchen. And it's important, I think, to know like how much better, right?
So in this situation, we have to use the station score as a measure because it matters what station you're working. A garde manger station at a pretty sleepy bistro is completely different than the entremet station at a 2 Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco. And so instead of trying to compare those 2 stations, we judge the person working the station and their ability to hit those 9 domination measures as we define them. And even then, I'm admitting I believe we're getting as close as we could possibly get, because what we'd really need to do if we wanted to be hyper accurate is to put those 2 same people that we're trying to evaluate against one another on the same station, in the same kitchen, on the same day, with the same team and the same menu and the same equipment and the same number of guests. And I'm not the only one to call it out. David says the same thing. He references this. He says, quote,
now, if you think about this restaurant, let's say Gramercy Tavern, that's been around almost 30 years. There's probably been, think about it, 900 to 1,000 different iterations of garde manger station. At Gramercy Tavern, which has 2 there's the back dining room and you have the tavern room. Well, let's just say the back dining room of Gramercy Tavern. I would say, just off the top of my head, 900 to 1,000 iterations of garde manger there. It's a lot. It's a lot of fucking data. Now, let's just say you start taking all the data out and you're able to spread it all out because it's been organized so the combination of different cooks and different menu items and seasonality that can all play a role in a good service or not. You sort of take out the bottom third, you take out the top third, and now you're here in the middle. And that's sort of important to know. It's like, okay, now I want to identify why this bottom third was so bad. Was it because they're bad? Was it because we changed the menu 1,000 times or
some of the people in that bottom third actually in the top third in different circumstances?
Right. Or sometimes you put a really bad cook with a good cook that's better than 2 good cooks, right? And I want to know the qualities of what made the top third great. And then of that top third, I want to know the top 1%, why they were so fucking good. And if I can distill that into a number,
Your ability to say, cool, I have a 90% station score at this bistro in Cincinnati versus I have a 90% station score on the fish station at Bennu in San Francisco. That to me is the closest we can reasonably get to talking about evaluating performance. And so to me, like the measures we're using have to be objective. They have to be skills, not signifiers, and they have to be able to track over time. And just speaking from personal experience here, like it is this reset moment when you move stations, similar to what David Chang talks about. Because when you get promoted or you switch positions, we recommend taking your station score again because it serves as this really helpful reminder for what slipped, what is lacking in my execution now, where can I be better? And all of this has kind of culminated to this quote that David Chang shares. He says, quote,
not that anyone would do it right now, but I believe a huge business could be created by getting the data and analytics in a kitchen to the degree where unequivocally so, you can find the right balance of cooks in a kitchen with the right balance of front of the house to get the maximum performance in a restaurant. And data would allow you to do that. And a lot of times it's intuitive to the chef and the general manager to just put that together. But I don't see why you wouldn't be able to put that into an algorithm and be like, you know what? Every cook has a win above replacement. It's the fact. Every cook. I don't need anyone to tell me that's not true. It's not just in baseball, every job, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just it's a system for measuring whether or not, you're above 50% or below, right?
I personally believe it's possible. I believe it helps with decreasing turnover. It helps with managers mentoring people to be better. It helps with chef de parties to know exactly what to work on and improve. It helps the guest experience. It helps people to get more excited with joining the hospitality industry when they know how to evaluate how they're doing in their day-to-day work. The list goes on. This is by far the most important project that I've ever worked on in my career. I was so stoked when one of you folks shared this David Chang podcast episode with me. And so, David Chang, if you're listening, this is a message for you. I will come to any one of your restaurants and implement Total Station Domination. I would love to show you what this program can do. We have the data collection product fully built out. It shows changes in performance along scoring sessions. You can use it on the hiring side, the HR side, the career progression side. The list goes on. And so, I have my email linked in the description, David. If you're listening, I would been eating at a ton of your different restaurants. I have a full eating out video on the channel where I had a meal at Momofuku. So sorry to hear that restaurant ended up shuttering. But I'm just eager to hear from you folks too. If you're listening, screenshot this episode, share it with a friend, a station partner, a fellow student if you're in culinary school. And if you run a kitchen and you want this for your team, please also send me an email, send me a message. I'm way too easy to get a hold of. And we'll talk. I'd be honored to speak with any one of you. Don't forget to rate the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. My name is Justin Khanna. Thanks so much as always for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one.